So great question, Jai, and hopefully there's been an entree to this question on the previous question. But again, we've got to be careful of American advice in the Australian market. It was, Harry S. Dent routinely comes over from America into Australia and talks about, hypes up some clickbait around how our market is going to collapse and crash, and has predicted 11 of the last 0 property crashes in this country. So he makes a comment in this video, Ben, of diversify risk. So when so much money is allocated to one asset, he considers that risky around his family home, right? But he also talks in this video about San Francisco, New York, and Los Angeles, right, which are very expensive cities. A bit like Sydney is a very, very expensive city. So I think there's some elements to what he says in the video, which is largely, to summarize it, Ben, for people for this podcast, it's largely saying, don't buy into the great American dream just because you think that's what you should do. He goes, run the numbers. He feels like the Association of Realtors created a propaganda campaign 100 years ago that said everyone should have the great American dream. We all focus on that, and no one ever questions it. So that's the premise. Then he goes and says, you've got to run the numbers. And then he goes through the numbers, Ben, and he said, you've got to pay the taxes, and you've got to do all the ongoing costs, and you've got to do the interest. And he talks about the example where someone says, grandma bought it for 100,000, then she sold it for 900,000. So therefore she made 800,000. He's like, no, what about all the costs, all the hidden costs? And he runs through all the hidden costs of owning property, which we acknowledge as well. So I guess the message that he says in the video, Ben, is just run the numbers. And lo and behold, we would agree, particularly if we were looking to buy in New York, or if we were looking to buy in San Francisco, or we were looking to buy in Los Angeles, big, expensive cities that require huge outlays. In those cities, it might make sense to rent-vest. We've had Chris Gray on this podcast very early days. He's probably the highest profile rent-vestor in this country. He thinks you should just rent and let your properties do the work. But he's got a very significant property portfolio. There's been times when I've rent vested across the journey as well too, Ben. So we're not saying rent vesting is a bad idea, but he is categorically putting a mast in the ground, saying you don't need to do that. Rent somewhere else. It's in the video. He says it's 2.2 times more expensive to live in the same house than if you rented. Sure, because you're carrying all the costs, right? But then he goes on to say there's, and I'll just rattle these off and then come to you for commentary, Ben.
Sure,
But he said, here's the questions he asks before he buys. Number one, am I holding it for 10 years or more? Number two, does it represent less than 28% of the gross income as the repayment? Number three, save 20% so that it actually signals that you can save. Number four, be okay if the value of your house goes down. And number five, am I excited about buying, or do I just feel like I'm buying into a propaganda dream along the journey? So there's a bit to unpack there, Ben. But another very high profile guest who has been on Tim Ferriss's podcast, has a book, I Will Teach You to Be Rich. He's got his own Netflix series. I've watched and listened to a bunch of his podcasts and his material, and I too rate him. But I just have the ability over the journey, Ben, of doing this for a long time to be able to decipher the differences between the markets that he's operating in and what works here in Australia.
Yeah, so let's try and be very fundamental about this particular story. We've got a set of rules, legislations, principles that the Australian property market operate under. And we treat investment property different than we treat owner-occupied property. In fact, we have a principal place of residence concession on one property that we own. So any value appreciation that we have on that property is capital gains tax free. That is not necessarily the case in the US. In the US, they also have tax deductibility. So if you borrow money to buy your principal home, you can also offset that against some of the taxes that you pay. So straight away, the mechanics and the rules of the market that's being formed are completely different, okay, in terms of that. Now, again, I would still say, even though the rules are different, overlay the economic activity story on those blocks of land in those highly desirable locations, and you get significant price appreciation, okay? And that's because as biological creatures, there's a couple of things that are important to us. What other people think of us is unfortunately very important to us. But we also we're social creatures. So we like to be around other people. And so social status, human interest, human behavior stuff absolutely plays into price value in particular locations. And if we think about price and affordability and value, it comes off those most expensive properties and then trickles down. So ultimately, if you are buying in a middle suburb of a big city or in a small suburb of a small city, if that's not the most expensive or aspirational or most exclusive land or location, then you are ultimately a price taker, no matter what you think. And so timing that market is the most important thing, because the reality is that you are getting a ripple effect or a valuation effect that will be judged over decades, not necessarily just years. So you might be able to find an arbitrage in the market and move quickly in there for 2 or 3 years. But I can't find a case anywhere in the world where locations, if you're attached to a city and a central, gravity of an economic powerhouse, which is a CBD, then ultimately that land and purpose of use will almost always guarantee that the land values are more expensive. And so anything from there, you're absolutely a price taker, not a price maker. So it's really important to understand those principles when you are investing. And so I'm always saying to myself, the cities that I want to invest in or the locations that I want to invest in, what's first and foremost? Is this city or country, this state, territory, or whatever, is it going to be around in the next 50 years? Inside that 50 years, what's going to be its economic drivers? What's its competitive advantage to other towns or cities around the country? All right. And when you get to those mega cities, and this is what we've also got to remember, when you think about Melbourne and Sydney, they just fall outside of the top 100 cities by populations in the world. So in theory, they are mega cities, right? But there's only 9 cities in America that are bigger than Melbourne and Sydney. And a lot of people forget that. Okay, so if I was investing, and in my principles, I would absolutely be looking at investing in those bigger cities, because I'm looking for that long-term economic story first and foremost. And then I'll take my price point in that particular location. And I know ultimately I'll be judged by the economic growth that happens in that area, and I will get the trickle down unless I'm buying in the most exclusive locations. But as investors, we don't usually do that because the yields are no good. So I'm trying to get that balance right between capital growth and yield to keep me in the market. So I'm always ultimately a price taker. Even if I'm buying 5 kilometres, 7 kilometres from a CBD, I'm a price taker, unless I'm buying something where I'm going to change the productive use of that land, and then effectively I'm turning apples into apple pie. So that just gives you some context in terms of the way in which I look at the world. And so, the idea of potentially rent vesting in those bigger cities, yeah, maybe. But I'd also say, and we've been consistent from day one on this podcast, I would like people to have some connection of property, if they can afford it, close to the Sydney area, in the Sydney Basin, or in the Melbourne metropolitan area more broadly. And if you're thinking in decades, that's going to be really good for you. But I also see up and coming cities that have got a lot of excellent fundamentals from an economic point of view and have competitive advantages associated with it. And they might have the next 10 or 20 years where they really define themselves as a city, and the industries and the people that move there, and that ultimately bodes very, very well, like Seattle as a good story, very, very well in terms of their future economic prosperity and the prosperity of the people who are there, and that ultimately shows up in the price of property.
Yeah, well said. Australia's got a superpower, and that's that we punch out of our weight division as an economic powerhouse based on the population base, and we've got lots of people who want to move here. So therefore, we don't have enough houses. So if you just imagine anywhere in this country, particularly on the coastals, even the coastals that lead, as a hub and spoke out of
Yep.
the major capitals that exist now. When we double in population, imagine what it's like to not only live in those urban centres, but also those fringe that will become super cities. Brisbane and the Gold Coast will be one big super
One
city
big
in the
super city.
future, even
Yep.
though you can see a lot of greenfields now. So what I'd say to you, Jai, is this. You are a property portfolio plan client. So you could go back and you could have a look at the surplus that you trap within your plan, And you've just decided to trap that surplus and put that towards established residential property. That's effectively what you've chosen to do. However, you could also grab that surplus that you trap, and you could actually do what these American commentators do. Because out of interest, Ramit Sethi, even though it's spelled Sethi, I'll try and get it right, Ben Sethi. Him and Morgan Housel have the same. They have the same philosophy. Morgan has a house, Ramit doesn't, but otherwise they hold some cash and they put it into index funds, right? So Jai, you could do the same. You could actually take your money and put those into index funds, and you get that choice. We think there's an opportunity in Australia that would, and we still feel very comfortably personally, we're still very comfortable professionally, that we would encourage our clients to still trap that surplus and put it into residential property. But you can mirror what they do. So that's number one. Number two, they have access to the biggest markets in the world. The biggest companies, the biggest cash flows, the biggest finance flows go into that market. So the fact that they're dollar cost averaging into those markets is a strategic advantage they have. So if you choose to do that, you'd probably want to mirror that as well. You'd probably want a dollar cost average into American indexes as well that match access to some of those biggest markets. But at the end of the day, what he is doing is he is chasing an arbitrage opportunity of, instead of having a mortgage, he is renting. And then the difference in that video, he says it's 2.2 times more expensive to buy than own in the American market. So he's taking that extra 1.2 and putting it into the market. So great. That's wonderful, right? So we're just saying put it into residential real estate, but you can put it wherever you like. And the last thing is he's rent vesting, but not in the traditional narrative that has become associated in this country. Because what we're saying with rent vesting is we will rent and then go and put money, that 1.2 difference, we'll go and put it into other real estate. He's actually rent vesting into the stock market, right? So he's rent vesting and putting the difference into the market. But hopefully we've given you enough confidence there, Jai, that we haven't changed our own philosophies and liquidated everything to go and put it into markets. Do we have diversified portfolios? We've said that many times. Ben and I both have shares. We both have crypto. But the majority of our wealth is within our property portfolio and our business interests. So that will hopefully give you some understanding, and hopefully for anyone else who gets confused by other people, American authors who we can respect and love, because we do, coming into our market and giving information that can feel contradictory and can help us feel a bit wobbly. And I think to Jai's point, the last part of his question was, I'm looking for your argument to give someone like me reassurance we're on the right course, Ben. So I think that's important.
Yeah, it is. And look, I mean, we can only play by the rules in front of us. If the governments are stupid enough to change the rules, and that impacts the property market, there will be unintended consequences, right? We saw that when they banned negative gearing in 85 to 87. So our belief is that there will be no significant change to the market mechanisms and the rules in which we play by. And that will be actually good news story for the prosperity of the country. If you collapse the property market in this country, oh my God, you are talking about not a recession, you're talking about a depression. So most Treasury people and the smart people behind the politicians know this. Property is technically too big to fail, but ultimately you still got to keep getting that economic engine moving. All right. And so we still need to make sure people are employed and there are jobs of the future. If all of those things remain true, then property is an incredibly safe and reliable, boring investment. And we've also been consistent on this story too. 1, 2, maybe 3 good properties held for the long term in concert with your superannuation is going to deliver you a very comfortable retirement. $2,000 a week, call it what you will in terms of what it's going to do for you. So we've never deviated from that story as well. We're not necessarily interested in, the person who's got the 14th or 15th or 16th property. If that's going to be you and if that's going to be, the image of the world that you need to share for your own self-worth and recognition, I think it's crazy. I don't think you'll ever find happiness there. But ultimately, that's not us. We're interested in helping as many people that we can across this great nation to buy a couple of properties in concert with their super and some share investing, and then just get about their life, right? We're not building the next property moguls. That's not our journey here. Our journey is about lifestyle by design and creating financial peace. And you can do that with a couple of properties and also with some sensible money management as part of that story.
So Ben, to sort of round that out, I think if we circle back to the first question with Morgan, we're advocating for cash. He has in his asset allocation cash. So when we
Yep.
build a plan, we have a basic household liquidity that we make sure our clients do not fall below. Right. So tick, we mirror. Number two, his thing is to have a house. We, in most cases, encourage our clients to live in their own home. Not always, but quite often, yes. And then the third thing is he puts it into index funds. That's where we differ. We say put it into a couple of investment properties because you are getting the equivalent of the index funds in your super because you are dollar cost averaging there as well. So there we go, folks. Hopefully that helps a little bit with if you too felt a little confused as Jai and Anwar have with some of these amazing American commentators. There's a ton of stuff on YouTube that you don't want to listen to. But they're two guys who you definitely do want to listen to.